This is the Zach Ansbury Show.
I'm also, coincidentally, an editor of such a journal. Maybe we can talk about that later. So I respect these things. My journal is at the level it is at for very good reason. And it's only a B-rank journal. Yeah. So, and it doesn't deserve better, nor does it deserve to be worse. So I'm happy with that.
Okay, so you... I already knew that already, that you're an editor of a journal. Did you want to talk about that at all? I'm actually more particularly interested in, I'm interested in the journal itself, but more about how you found yourself to be the editor of a journal, because ultimately, part of what the podcasts are about is speaking about high achieving and very successful people, academia or industry in the marketing field. So it kind of gives us, a bit of a base, a bit of a story. How did these people get there? What can I learn from their successes? And maybe even any difficulties you had along the way, things that you'd kind of give some advice or heedance to. So tell us about the journal, and then how did you find yourself in that position? Because it's quite a prestigious position.
Thank you. I always had an interest in being an editor of a journal, but it's quite a close shop. And I now realize that although some journals advertise when there's a vacant position for editor or associate editor, most don't. And it's by appointment direct. So to answer your question, I was approached by Emerald Publishing, which owns a publishing house, which owns many, many academic journals, including the one I became the editor of, which is called the International Journal of Wine Business Research, or IJWBR acronym. When the previous editor indicated that he wanted to step down, they basically headhunted me and asked me, will I be prepared to step up to that level? And I was nothing in that journal in terms of the management structure. I was only on the editorial board. So I wasn't an associate editor or anything at the time. Have you been
publishing in that journal already?
Yes, I was just going to come to that. Now, I hope this doesn't sound slightly arrogant or very arrogant, but they basically tapped me on the shoulder because I'm the highest cited author of any author who's ever published in that journal.
Oh, wow.
In terms of...
Yeah, I did not know that.
No, let me just finish. In terms of papers published in that journal. So what I'm really saying is the papers I published before I became editor in that journal are the highest cited of all papers published in that journal to this day. So I did kick, to use that analogy, some goals for them, and that's how journals function. They want citations, which sells more downloads, which they make money from, people downloading papers to cite them, to read them, to cite them. So that's really how it happened, and it's now 6 years that I've been in this role. And I love it. It's very, very creative. It's a very big responsibility. It taps you on the shoulder integrity-wise all the time, that you have to be fair, that you need to sometimes make very unpopular decisions because sometimes you have reviewers who you select to review a paper. As an editor, you invite them to review the person's paper. They don't know who the author or authors are. I've, on more than one occasion, had to rescind reviews that were very severe on authors when, I basically have to override them and make an executive decision, which I rarely do, but I've had to do that, and it's not pleasant.
Because the feedback was very overly critical? Or?
Overly critical, or even personal, or because it's a small world, that I'm talking about. They guess who the author or authors might be, and, I have to step in and dissolve that situation, basically.
It's very interesting you should say that, because, having published and going through the revision cycle at journals before, you submit an article, it gets sent out often to, most of the time it's to other blind peers who review your work, and, you can wait a bit of time and you get the feedback. And sometimes the feedback doesn't seem, quite fair or anything, but I've had a very positive experience recently, actually, where I had minimal feedback from 2 reviewers from a journal, and I was happy to incorporate it because it was good feedback. And then I could tell the 3rd reviewer really knew my field and really knew my discipline in terms of the methods. And so I'm now sort of debating them about sort of the nuances of these methods. And but I really liked that approach because it was very constructive and they were very supportive. And the paper now at the third level of revision, despite it being a whole lot more work, is by far a better paper than it was at the beginning. And so I'm very thankful for the third reviewer, because if it does manage to get out, which I'm hopeful it does, then I have that supportive reviewer to thank for that. And so that's sort of your role as the editor, is to filter between authors or researchers and the reviewing system, right? Or
That's absolutely spot on, Zach. That's why when I became editor, I immediately made one change and later some others, but this change I, to this day, think is definitely the right thing that I've done. The journal's policy is to have double-blind peer review. That means 2 reviews. I said, no, I will use 3. And the reason, that was a common sense decision. It wasn't rocket science by any stretch of the imagination, is that if A says the paper is great, B says it's very poor, I need somebody to break the deadlock. That helps me from not having to step in personally too often, if you understand what I'm saying. So it's a bit like a jury. 2-4, 1 against means 2-4 is a majority. That doesn't mean that the person whose negative comments are minimalized or ignored or anything. It just helps me to make that very important decision when a paper, and most papers in my journal go through 2 revisions, by the way, some 3, but mostly 2, almost never only 1, whether we ask for a revision or just reject the paper. So once there is a revision, has been a revision called for, the chances of the paper getting published are very, very high, provided the authors follow the leads or the requests of the reviewers and the editor.
Yeah, I've often found that getting past the first round of review is a good sign that, you have reviewers who are, and the editor as well, quite often are, they think the topic's important and therefore they're happy to sort of provide an external mentoring role, I suppose, to get you and that work out, because it's good for them, it's good for their journal, it's good for, the scientific discipline, I suppose.
That's absolutely right. Now, wearing my author hat for a change, because that's how I experience it. Otherwise, it's going to sound like I talk about myself as an editor all the time. So I have actually much more experience on the other side of the fence by being an author and receiving reviews and critiques and rejections often, and many acceptances too. I've, by the way, published 161 research journal articles to date. And I'm not finished yet, fingers crossed, touch wood. But I must say that I totally agree with what you've just said. Some editors are so generous, so good, and the reviewers too, even if they reject the paper, you can see they've spent time on it. They give you advice where they think you should submit it next to which journal and what you should change and stuff like that. Others, though, are the exact opposite. I received a rejection, in fact, during this week, I think it was Tuesday or Monday, from a journal. I will not mention the name for professional reasons. And the editor felt fit to reject the paper based on one reviewer's remarks. There wasn't even 2 reviews, 1.
Yeah.
And that immediately is an issue. This is a quite highly ranked journal, so it should not use one reviewer. And upon reading what the reviewer said, the reviewer actually asked for many things to be changed. The reviewer never said reject the paper. And the editor decided to reject the paper because I think he or she, let's just keep it general neutral, did not read the comments even properly. Okay. So that is the kind of thing you have to deal with in this game, unfortunately. So it's a bit of, half a dozen and half a dozen, and you just have to cope with this. But it does happen.
Yeah, and I think that's why the system should be, minimal to, ideally 3 reviewers. And it seems like having another reviewer means, more to contend with. But I've actually found the review systems that have used 3 rather than 2 to be more favourable and more having the desired outcome, which is creation of better knowledge.
That's just the only negative. I would say it's totally positive, overwhelmingly positive to have 3 versus 2 is to get 3.
Yes.
That is difficult because reviewers, just by the way, for the audience, I'll give you some metrics if I just rack my memory a little bit, that if I invited 10 people to review a paper, I'll probably get a 30% acceptance rate.
30.
The other 7 would say, I don't have time,
Wow.
I don't want to, or they'll simply ignore me. So you can imagine, I've had cases where I have a paper, and to get 3 reviewers, I've had to ask, I think the highest I've ever asked was 21 people.
Wow.
And you can imagine the amount of effort and time that takes, because I have to go and look in the database for a person who matches this paper,
Yeah.
skills and knowledge-wise. And that is, tough.
It's
But
not
that's
just
what it takes. That's what it takes to be a good editor.
Yeah, it's not just a pick someone out of a hat type of method. You're actually trying to find someone who maybe knows the method or knows the literature or is well published in the area, or maybe a bright up-and-comer. Or do you aim for reviewers that have a different level of experience? Do you aim for someone who is, like a research fellow, like a level that I'm kind of at, and then mix it up with someone who's, much more senior, like a professor at your level? Do you try to...
Yes, I know this is slightly a minefield, what you've just asked me. Yes, the answer is yes. I am very aware, most often I'm aware of, who the person is. It's not difficult if the person is unknown to me to know in my field that this person is a PhD student or a very junior researcher, and I really take this very seriously. I regard myself as a good mentor of younger academic staff, even not only my own, I'm talking about all over. So I always say I help you to get published. So I'm not going to send the paper off to people who will absolutely destroy it and the person's confidence, etc., etc. There are ways to do it. So I try and get a good balance between the reviewers, such as, yes, the top class, world well-known professor in the field versus people who are, probably middle of the road. Also, it's of course field-specific. People who are experts in certain fields are sometimes rare. There are only a few of them, and sometimes there are a lot of them.
Yeah.
Yes. I'll cite an example in our field, consumer behavior. If I'm just looking broadly in consumer behavior, I'll have hundreds in my system. We, by the way, have 2,000 reviewers in our system. Even for a small journal, that's very good. And there would be hundreds in consumer behavior. If I go into digital marketing, for example, or climate change, I have a problem.
Yeah.
Because immediately there only be a few dozen, if that.
And then your acceptance rate of 30%
yes.
means that if you have a few dozen...
That's right.
Yeah.
So I also try, can I just say something also in addition to that? You haven't asked me this. I try and broaden the scope in terms of topic-wise. So lately, I've noticed, and we never did before, publish papers in the field of econometrics.
Yes, true.
And I've attracted 1 or 2, or they came, I can't say I attracted them. They submitted papers to the journal. Once they got published, because often these people are very, very strong who write in that field, once they got accepted and published, others saw it and came. And it's not an avalanche or anything, but more and more of these are happening. I'm now having that in climate change. I'm even having that in gender issues.
Wow.
In the wine industry, because somebody submitted a paper, it was a very good paper, we published and others saw it and followed the lead. So there's momentum. And then, of course, wine tourism, which is primarily one of my fields of interest, is very, very popular.